I am Nia. I am 42 years old. Today I watched my ex-husband and his new wife steal my designated seat at my only son's high school graduation. The woman, who had never worked a day in her life, looked me up and down, laughed, and told me that real mothers can watch from the standing room in the back. My ex-husband, the man I put through finance school by working back-to-back night shifts in the neonatal intensive care unit, sat right beside her and told me not to cause a scene. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply walked away and stood by the exit doors. What they did not know was that my son had seen the entire exchange from the wings of the stage. And when he stepped up to the podium to deliver his valedictorian speech, he did not thank them. Instead, he pointed directly at his stepmother and revealed a secret that destroyed their fake wealthy lives forever. Before I take you through exactly how their empire crumbled, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to smile through the pain while a toxic family tried to break your spirit. Before I even stepped foot inside the Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy, my day had already been a whirlwind. I had spent the last 4 hours locked in a high-stakes boardroom in the city center, finalizing the acquisition of a rival medical staffing agency. My hands were still tingling with the quiet adrenaline of closing the biggest corporate deal of my entire life. But as I drove my modest sedan down the tree-lined avenue toward the school, my mind shifted entirely to my son. Jamal was my everything. The grueling shifts, the sleepless nights, the endless sacrifices, they were all for him. The air inside the auditorium was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and designer perfumes. This was the kind of school where tuition cost more than what most people make in a year. I navigated through the sea of wealthy parents, my eyes scanning the front row. There was a velvet-roped section right in front of the podium. A gold placard resting on the center chair clearly read, "Mother of the Valedictorian." I felt a surge of overwhelming pride. I had earned that seat. For 2 decades, I worked endless double shifts as a nurse. I knew the sterile smell of the hospital corridors better than the scent of my own home. I remembered the nights I sat at the kitchen table eating instant ramen noodles so I could afford to buy Jamal fresh organic vegetables and the expensive textbooks his advanced placement classes required. I functioned on 3 hours of sleep for years just to afford his private tutors. Marcus had been completely absent during those critical years. He was too busy chasing status, buying luxury cars on credit, and pretending to be a high-rolling finance director while constantly claiming he did not have enough money for his basic child support payments. But as I approached the VIP section, my steps faltered. Sitting directly in my reserved chair was Chloe. She was 32 years old, my ex-husband Marcus's new wife. Chloe was a woman who proudly called herself a beauty studio owner, even though everyone in our circle knew her business was a failing vanity project entirely funded by Marcus. Her pastel silk dress draped perfectly over her frame. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the auditorium lights, a piece of jewelry I knew for a fact Marcus had financed on a high-interest credit card. Right next to her was Marcus wearing a custom Italian suit, soaking up the admiration of the other elite parents. I walked straight up to the chair and stood over Chloe. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "That seat is reserved for me. My name is on the placard." Chloe looked up at me slowly. Her pale blue eyes scanned my tailored blazer, but I could tell she was deliberately looking at me as if I were still the exhausted, overworked nurse in cheap scrubs from 10 years ago. She let out a soft, mocking laugh that made my blood boil. "Oh, Nia, you actually made it," Chloe said. Her voice was pitched perfectly, just loud enough to draw the attention of the wealthy parents sitting in the adjacent rows. "We figured you were stuck at the hospital doing another double shift to pay your rent, or maybe your old car broke down on the interstate again. But really, his real mom can just watch from the back. The VIP seats are for the people who actually contribute to Jamal's future." Contribute. I repeated the word, tasting bitter in my mouth. I felt a cold, heavy wave of absolute shock wash over me quickly, followed by a sharp, protective anger. I am his mother. I raised him completely on my own, while Marcus was out playing bachelor on the weekends and dodging his responsibilities. Chloe just smirked, entirely unbothered by the truth. She tossed her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. Well, I paid for the Tom Ford suit Jamal is wearing today. He needs a mother figure who understands how to navigate high society, not someone who smells like hospital sanitizer and works for an hourly wage. We do not want to embarrass the poor boy in front of the school board, do we? Marcus and I are building a real legacy for him here. I turned my gaze to Marcus. I fully expected him to intervene. He was an African-American man who knew exactly how hard we had to fight to get into these elite spaces. He knew the systemic barriers we faced. He knew exactly how many nights I stayed awake drilling calculus formulas into Jamal's head, while he was out networking at golf courses trying to impress executives who barely remembered his name. But Marcus did not defend me. He did not ask his wife to show some basic respect to the mother of his child. Instead, his face twisted into a mask of pure annoyance. "Do not cause a scene," Nia Marcus whispered through clenched teeth. His breath smelled of expensive espresso and deep-seated cowardice. "Half of my bank's investors are in this room right now. You always bring this loud, bitter energy everywhere you go. Remember Jamal's 8th birthday when you showed up in your work scrubs just to make me look like a bad provider in front of my friends? Do not do this today." Chloe bought the boy a $5,000 suit so he would look like he belongs up there. Just go find a seat in the general admission area before you humiliate us all and ruin Jamal's big day. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his words, another voice chimed in from the row directly behind them. It was Brad. Brad was Marcus's brother-in-law, a white real estate broker who had married Marcus's sister, Tasha. Brad had always treated me like the hired help walking around family gatherings with an unearned sense of superiority and constantly making passive-aggressive comments about my neighborhood. He leaned over the back of Chloe's chair, a smug, tight-lipped grin plastered across his face. "Come on, Nia," Brad said, his tone dripping with that familiar, patronizing arrogance I had endured for years. "Chloe is the kind of educated, refined woman Jamal needs to be associated with if he wants to get into the Ivy Leagues. A former nurse who scraped by on minimum wage just does not fit the picture anymore. Do not make this about your fragile ego. Let the boy have a classy family representing him for once. You should be grateful Chloe is willing to step up and provide the luxury lifestyle you never could." I stood there surrounded by the very people who had tried to break my spirit, who had constantly minimized my existence to elevate their own fragile egos. They still saw me as the exhausted, overworked, struggling single mother from a decade ago. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy playing pretend in their heavily mortgaged suburban mansions, I had quietly built an empire of my own. They did not know that I was no longer wearing scrubs, or that the corporate merger I just left made me the chief executive officer of the largest medical supply chain in the state. And they certainly did not know that the luxury suit Chloe supposedly bought was paid for with a credit card that was literally days away from being declined, or that the financial ground they were sitting on was about to collapse beneath them. I took a deep, steadying breath, fighting the overwhelming urge to pull out my phone and show them the receipts right then and there. I wanted to tear down their arrogant facade, but I knew this was not the right moment. The true reckoning was about to happen on that stage, and I absolutely refused to steal my son's thunder. So I simply smiled a cold, knowing smile that made Brad blink in confusion, and I turned my back on them. I walked slowly and deliberately down the aisle, stopping to stand quietly by the exit doors at the back of the hall. I folded my arms and waited, my eyes fixed on the velvet curtains of the stage, ready to watch my brilliant son burn their entire world to the ground. But Brad and Tasha were not the type of people to let a silent retreat go unpunished. My refusal to break down in tears, my refusal to give them the hysterical reaction they desperately craved, must have felt like a direct insult to their inflated egos. I had barely settled against the cool brass of the exit door when I heard the heavy, aggressive clicking of Tasha's heels marching up the aisle. Brad was trailing right behind her, his chest puffed out like a guard dog. They had actually left their precious stolen VIP seats just to come corner me in the shadows of the auditorium. They could not stand the thought of me having the last word, even if that word was silence. "Do not think you can just smile at me like some psycho and walk away," Brad hissed. He invaded my personal space, his face flushed red, his voice an ugly, grating whisper meant to intimidate me. "Chloe went out of her way to make sure Jamal looks like he comes from money today. That Tom Ford suit alone cost more than you make in 3 months of cleaning up hospital waste. The least you could do is say thank you instead of acting like you own the place. You should be down on your knees thanking God that my sister-in-law stepped up to be a real mother to that boy." I did not raise my voice. I did not even uncross my arms at first. I simply looked at Brad, taking in his cheap cologne and his misplaced arrogance. Then I looked at Tasha, who was glaring at me with her arms crossed, looking at me as if my mere presence was a stain on her family's imaginary legacy. They were so predictable, so incredibly easy to read. "You really think Chloe bought that suit?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly quiet, letting the words hang in the air between us. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against the crisp, folded piece of paper I had been carrying all morning. It was the original designer boutique receipt. I slowly pulled it out deliberately, stepping forward to close the distance between us. I tapped the stiff paper gently against Brad's chest, right over his pounding heart. "That suit," I whispered, staring directly into his pale eyes, "was paid for in full with my American Express Centurion card. The black card, Brad. And that precious new wife of Marcus's, she tried to buy it first, all right." She stood at the register and confidently handed the cashier her card, eager to play the wealthy savior. "Do you want to know what happened?" "It was declined." The cashier tried it twice. "Declined for insufficient funds. Her card has been completely maxed out since last Tuesday. You might want to check your sister-in-law's credit score and maybe your brother-in-law's bank accounts before you stand in my face and brag about her overwhelming generosity." Brad's jaw practically unhinged. The smug, superior color drained from his face instantly, leaving him looking pale and foolish. He stared at the receipt in my hand, his eyes tracking the total amount and the payment method printed in bold black ink. Tasha gasped, snatching the receipt from my fingers. Her eyes frantically scanned the paper, desperately looking for a reason to deny reality. She read the authorization code, the name on the card, and the total. "This is fake!" Tasha shrieked. She crumpled the receipt in her fist and violently shoved my shoulder, forcing me to take a step back. Her voice echoed slightly in the cavernous space at the back of the hall, immediately drawing the eyes of the security guards stationed near the entrance. "You are using cheap computer tricks to make us look bad. You have always been a manipulative liar trying to ruin my brother's happiness. You cannot stand that he leveled up and left you in the dust." Suddenly Marcus was there. He had scurried up the aisle the moment he saw Tasha, raising her voice, desperate to contain the mess his family was making. He grabbed Tasha's arm, yanking her back. His eyes were wide with sheer panic as he noticed several wealthy parents turning their heads toward our commotion, their faces pinched with polite disapproval. "I warned you not to start your ghetto drama here." Marcus spat at me, his voice trembling with rage. He completely ignored the fact that his sister had just physically assaulted me. "I will have security throw you out right now. You are not going to ruin this family's reputation today. I will not let you drag us down to your level." I did not even bother to look at him. My eyes had already shifted past his shoulder, darting straight to the brilliantly lit stage. The heavy velvet curtains had parted slightly. Standing right there in the shadows of the wings waiting for his cue was Jamal. He looked immaculate in the tailored suit I had bought him. His posture was perfectly straight, his expression an unreadable mask of absolute focus. He saw his father pointing a threatening finger in my face. He saw Tasha hyperventilating and clutching the crumpled receipt. He saw Chloe sitting alone in my seat at the front, completely oblivious to the crumbling of her lies. Then Jamal's eyes lifted and met mine across the massive, crowded room. My beautiful, brilliant boy gave me one single, imperceptible nod. We did not need words. We knew exactly what was about to happen. It was time. I smoothed down my blazer, brushing away where Tasha had shoved me. I gave Marcus a look of utter, chilling indifference and voluntarily took another step back toward the heavy exit doors. Go ahead and sit down, Marcus, I said softly, a wave of anticipation humming in my veins. The show is about to start, and you do not want to miss a single word. The principal's voice boomed over the sound system, requesting everyone to please take their seats for the commencement address. Marcus shot me one last disgusted glare before grabbing Tasha and Brad by their arms. He dragged them back down the aisle, hurrying to return to their stolen VIP section before the principal noticed the disruption. They sat down just as the auditorium lights dimmed, plunging the audience into an expectant hush. I stayed exactly where I was, my back against the wall, my heart beating a steady, victorious rhythm. The heavy oak doors of the auditorium remained closed behind me, sealing us all inside this grand, echoing chamber of privilege. From my vantage point at the very back of the hall, the entire scene unfolded like a perfectly staged theatrical production. The lighting overhead cast a warm golden glow across the sea of expectant faces. Row after row of affluent parents sat with perfect posture, their expensive jewelry catching the light, their hushed conversations creating a low, buzzing hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Down in the very front, occupying the exact center of the VIP section, Marcus and Chloe had settled into their plush velvet chairs. I watched with quiet fascination as Chloe leaned closer to Marcus, her hand resting possessively on his tailored sleeve. She whispered something in his ear, and he let out a short, arrogant laugh, his chest puffing out with unearned pride. Tasha and Brad sat directly behind them, their heads leaning forward to join the conversation, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine dangling directly over their meticulously curated lives. They truly believed they had won. They thought my retreat to the back of the auditorium was an admission of defeat, a silent surrender to their overwhelming social superiority. They had no idea that I had not retreated. I had simply taken the best seat in the house to watch their execution. The grand piano on the far side of the stage struck the opening chords of the processional march, and the low hum of the crowd instantly dissolved into a respectful silence. The heavy velvet curtains parted completely, revealing the graduating class of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. They marched out in perfect unison, a sea of pristine navy blue robes and gleaming gold tassels. The parents around me shifted in their seats, raising their phones and expensive cameras, eager to capture the moment. My eyes, however, were locked on only one person. Jamal walked near the front of the line, his stride purposeful and measured. Beneath the traditional graduation gown, the crisp lines of the Tom Ford suit I had bought for him were clearly visible. He looked older in that moment, carrying a heavy maturity that far exceeded his 18 years. He did not wave to the crowd. He did not scan the front rows for his father. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, burning with a quiet, intense determination that mirrored my own. As the students took their seats on the tiered risers behind the podium, Principal Sterling stepped up to the microphone. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a booming voice that commanded immediate authority. He began the standard commencement pleasantries, speaking of academic excellence, future leaders, and the bright horizons awaiting this exceptional class. I listened to his words, but my mind drifted back to the reality of what it took to get Jamal into that chair. Principal Sterling spoke of dedication, and I thought of the countless weekends I spent picking up extra shifts at the hospital just to pay for Jamal's advanced placement exam fees. The principal spoke of unwavering family support, and I watched Marcus nodding along in the front row, eagerly accepting the praise for a job he completely abandoned a decade ago. It was sickening to watch my ex-husband bask in the glory of my grueling labor. He had missed every parent-teacher conference, every late-night study session, every moment of panic and triumph. Yet there he sat, smiling for the cameras, ready to claim Jamal's success as his own personal achievement. And then Principal Sterling shifted his notes, his expression turning solemn and incredibly proud. It is now my distinct honor to introduce a young man who truly embodies the spirit of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy, the principal announced, his voice echoing clearly through the massive hall. This student has not only maintained a flawless academic record, but he has done so with a level of grace, humility, and fierce dedication that has inspired our entire faculty. He is a young man of profound integrity. Please join me in welcoming your valedictorian, Jamal Harrison. The applause was thunderous. The wealthy parents, the faculty, the students, everyone rose to their feet to honor my son. Down in the VIP section, Marcus stood up faster than anyone else. He was clapping loudly, looking around to make sure everyone saw him, practically shouting his connection to the boy of the hour. Chloe stood beside him, smiling brightly, playing the role of the devoted, supportive stepmother to absolute perfection. They were soaking up the applause, absorbing the admiration of the elite crowd, as if they had somehow engineered this moment through their sheer presence. Jamal stood up from his seat on the risers. He did not rush. He walked across the polished wooden floor of the stage with a slow, deliberate cadence. Every eye in the auditorium was fixed on him. When he reached the podium, he set his folded notes down, but he did not look at them. He reached out with both hands and adjusted the microphone, the screech of feedback slicing through the applause and bringing the room to a sudden, absolute silence. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly. His gaze swept over the crowd, passing over the wealthy strangers, passing over the faculty members until his eyes locked onto the front row. He stared directly at Marcus and Chloe. "Good morning," Jamal began, his voice deep, resonant, and completely devoid of the usual nervous tremor you would expect from a high school student. He sounded like a man about to deliver a verdict. "I am supposed to stand here today and talk to you about the future. I am supposed to share inspiring quotes about chasing our dreams and thanking the people who helped us achieve them. But before we can honestly look toward the future, we have to be absolutely truthful about the past. We have to acknowledge the real foundation of our success, and more importantly, we have to expose the lies that some people use to claim credit for it." A subtle shift rippled through the auditorium. The polite, expectant smiles on the faces of the parents began to falter. This was not the standard uplifting valedictory speech they had paid to hear. The tension in the air spiked instantly, turning the atmosphere thick and heavy. Down in the front row, Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the sudden stiffness in his posture. Chloe's bright smile had frozen into a tight, confused grimace. She glanced nervously at Marcus, but he was staring fixedly at the stage, a look of dawning apprehension creeping across his face. "For my entire life," Jamal continued, his voice echoing with crystal-clear precision across the silent hall, "I have watched a singular definition of hard work. I have watched a woman wake up at 4 in the morning, put on faded medical scrubs, and work 14-hour shifts just to make sure the electricity stayed on. I have watched her eat the leftovers from my dinner plate so I could have enough energy for my exams. I have watched her sacrifice every comfort, every luxury, and every hour of her own peace to ensure I had the opportunity to stand on this stage today." He paused, letting the profound weight of his words settle over the affluent crowd. Many of the parents were now looking at each other, murmuring in hushed tones. Jamal's eyes remained locked on the front row. He raised his right hand and pointed a single, unwavering finger directly at Chloe. "So you can imagine my absolute disgust," Jamal said, his voice dropping an octave, ringing with a cold, terrifying authority, "when I stood in the wings of this stage just 10 minutes ago and watched that woman sitting in the front row, my father's new wife, look my mother in the eye and tell her to go stand in the back. I watched that woman who has never contributed a single dime or a single moment of genuine care to my life claim that she paid for the suit I am wearing. I watched my father sit right beside her and do absolutely nothing, while the woman who actually built my future was treated like garbage." The entire auditorium gasped collectively. It was a sharp, unified intake of breath that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. The polite murmurs instantly escalated into shocked, frantic whispering. Heads whipped around, searching for the mother he was talking about. Down in the VIP section, the illusion was completely shattered. Chloe went entirely pale, the blood draining from her face so fast she looked physically ill. She shrank back into the velvet chair, trying to make herself as small as possible under the crushing weight of 1,000 judging eyes. Marcus looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He was gripping the armrests of his chair, his jaw hanging open, completely paralyzed by the public exposure of his cowardice. Behind them, Tasha and Brad sat frozen like statues, their arrogant smirks utterly obliterated. Jamal was not finished. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice cutting through the rising chaos of the crowd. "Let me be absolutely clear," he stated, his words striking like physical blows. "The suit I am wearing was paid for by the chief executive officer of the largest medical supply chain in this state. A woman who built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing while my father was dodging child support and funding his new wife's failing beauty studio. My mother does not need a reserved seat to prove her worth. She owns the ground you are sitting on." I stood by the exit doors, the cool brass handle pressing against my back, watching my son deliver the ultimate reckoning. I did not smile. I did not move. I just watched as the carefully constructed fake wealthy lives of my ex-husband and his wife were publicly, spectacularly, and irreversibly burned to ash. The silence that followed Jamal's revelation was deafening, a heavy, suffocating blanket of shock that pinned Marcus and Chloe to their stolen seats. The show had indeed started, and they were the main event. The silence that followed Jamal's revelation was deafening, a heavy, suffocating blanket of shock that pinned Marcus and Chloe to their stolen seats. The show had indeed started, and they were the main event. Jamal stood perfectly still behind the heavy wooden podium. The spotlight caught the sharp, unrelenting angle of his jaw. He did not blink. He did not offer a reassuring smile to ease the brutal tension suffocating the room. Instead, he reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. Slowly, with agonizing deliberation, he pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. It was the speech he had submitted to the school board weeks ago. The safe, sterile, perfectly polite speech, thanking his family for their unwavering guidance. He raised the pages directly in front of the microphone. The entire auditorium held its collective breath, eyes glued to his hands. Jamal gripped the crisp white sheets. With one sharp, violent motion, he tore the entire speech straight down the middle. The harsh sound of tearing paper echoed through the high-fidelity speakers, a sound like a cracking whip that made Chloe physically flinch in her seat. Jamal dropped the shredded halves. They fluttered down, landing on the polished stage floor like dead leaves. He leaned back into the microphone. His eyes were dark, burning with a cold fire as he pointed his finger straight down at the VIP section one more time. I was supposed to read that. Jamal stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble that sent shivers through the crowd. I was supposed to stand up here and recite empty platitudes. I was expected to smile, play the role of the perfect son, and thank my father for his unwavering support. But perfection is a cheap illusion bought on high-interest credit, and I absolutely refuse to begin my adult life protecting the fragile egos of people who view me as a shiny trophy to display for their friends. A collective gasp rippled through the rows of elite parents. Whispers ignited like dry grass catching fire. The wealthy investors Marcus had spent the entire morning trying to impress were now leaning forward in their seats, their faces twisting with morbid curiosity and dawning disgust. Down in the front row, Marcus was visibly shrinking. The immaculate posture of the successful financial director had completely collapsed. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the stage lights. He desperately tried to stretch his mouth into a tight, dismissive smile, attempting to signal to the investors around him that this was just a teenage rebellion, a harmless joke. But his eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. Beside him, Chloe looked as if all the oxygen had been sucked from her lungs. She pressed her manicured hands over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically to the people sitting nearby, realizing with absolute horror that her carefully crafted image of the wealthy, benevolent stepmother was being publicly dismantled. "You want to talk about building a legacy?" Jamal continued, his voice echoing with devastating clarity. "Let us talk about the legacy of a man who missed every single parent-teacher conference, every science fair, and every late-night study session because he was too busy networking at the country club. A man who stopped paying child support the exact moment he realized he could no longer financially manipulate my mother. You sit in the front row today, Marcus, surrounded by banking executives you desperately want to impress, pretending you financed my success. But the only thing you ever financed was your own towering delusion. The whispers in the auditorium grew louder, transforming into a low, buzzing roar of judgment. The bank investors, sitting 2 rows behind Marcus, physically leaned away from him, their expressions hardening into absolute contempt. In their world, wealth was respected, but public exposure of financial fraud and parental abandonment was social suicide. Marcus's professional and social standing was evaporating in real time. Behind Marcus, Brad and Tasha were practically vibrating with panicked humiliation. Brad's face had drained of all color, his smug arrogance replaced by the terrified realization that they were directly in the blast radius of this public execution. Tasha clutched her expensive handbag to her chest like a shield, shrinking away from the piercing glares of the parents around them. They had spent years treating me like an inferior servant, and now they were being exposed as nothing more than parasitic enablers to a fraud. Jamal shifted his gaze, locking his eyes directly onto Chloe. And to the woman sitting in my mother's reserved chair, he said, his tone dropping to a chilling level of calm. You actually thought you could buy my respect with a designer label. You thought you could dismiss the woman who built a medical empire from the ground up just because she does not need to flaunt her wealth to feel validated. But true power does not need to announce itself. True power does not need to belittle others to feel tall. True power stands quietly at the back of the room, secure in the knowledge that a stolen velvet chair does not define your status. Chloe burst into tears. The pristine facade cracked entirely as thick black mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her expensive pastel dress. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ugly, humiliating sobs. She had wanted an audience for my destruction, and instead she had secured a sold-out crowd for her own. I remained perfectly still by the heavy brass exit doors. My heart was pounding a fierce, triumphant rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained an unreadable mask of absolute authority. I watched the people who had tried to break my spirit squirm under the crushing weight of public accountability. I did not need to shout. I did not need to fight them. My son, the boy I had poured my entire soul into raising, was fighting the battle for me with a grace and ferocity that left me breathless. Jamal finally looked away from the ruins of his father's ego. He lifted his chin and scanned the massive auditorium, his eyes searching the shadows at the very back of the hall until they found me. For the first time since he had stepped onto the stage, the cold, rigid mask melted away. A bright, genuine smile broke across his face, transforming him back into the loving boy I knew so well. "To the CEO," Jamal said, his voice thickening with deep, unfiltered emotion. "To the woman who ate instant ramen so I could eat fresh meals. To the woman who worked double shifts at the hospital and still stayed awake to quiz me on calculus equations until the sun came up. Mom, you earned the absolute front row of my life. But you are the only person in this entire room secure enough to know that your worth is not tied to a gold placard. You built an empire, but your greatest legacy is the fact that you taught me how to recognize the difference between real value and cheap imitation. Thank you for everything. I am exactly the man I am today because of you." The reaction was instantaneous. It did not start with polite, scattered applause. It started with Principal Sterling. The imposing, silver-haired man stepped forward from his seat on the stage and began to clap loudly, his face shining with profound respect. Then the faculty stood up. The graduating class rose to their feet, cheering for their classmate. Finally, the affluent parents, the very people Marcus and Chloe had spent years desperately trying to impress, stood up and joined the thunderous standing ovation. The sound was deafening, a tidal wave of genuine admiration that swept over the room. But the applause was not for Marcus. It was not for Chloe. It was for Jamal, and it was for me. Down in the VIP section, the scene was one of total devastation. Marcus tried to stand, perhaps to save face, or to make a quick exit, but his legs seemed to give out. He slumped back into his chair, covering his face with his hands, utterly broken. Chloe was inconsolable, weeping loudly and trying to hide behind her purse. Brad and Tasha were already bolting from their seats, pushing past the other parents in a desperate, frantic rush to escape the auditorium before anyone could associate them with the embarrassment sitting in the front row. I pushed gently off the back wall. I did not gloat. I did not laugh at their misery. I simply gave my brilliant son a warm, affirming nod across the sea of cheering people. I turned and pushed open the heavy exit doors, stepping out into the bright, warm sunlight of the afternoon, leaving the toxic remnants of my past completely behind me. Jamal gripped the edges of the heavy wooden podium, his knuckles turning white under the glaring stage lights. He did not break eye contact with the front row. The silence in the auditorium had stretched so tight it felt as though the very air was about to snap. He leaned closer to the microphone, his broad shoulders squared, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying calm. This speech was originally drafted to be a standard polite expression of gratitude. Jamal said, his deep voice carrying flawlessly through the high-fidelity speakers, washing over the sea of expectant faces. I was supposed to stand up here, look out at this distinguished crowd, and thank my family for their unwavering moral guidance. I was supposed to talk about the virtues of honesty and the sacrifices parents make for their children. But today I want to completely deviate from that script. Today I want to send a very special, deeply personal tribute to my stepmother, Chloe. Down in the VIP section, a sudden collective confusion rippled through the people sitting near them. Chloe visibly stiffened. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of bewildered hope crossed her heavily contoured face. Perhaps she actually thought Jamal was about to publicly validate her. Perhaps her narcissism was so deeply ingrained that she genuinely believed he was about to thank her for buying him the Tom Ford suit she had falsely claimed credit for. She sat up a little straighter, automatically lifting her chin and painting on a modest camera-ready smile. Marcus let out a long, shuddering breath, his chest visibly dropping as he mistakenly assumed the crisis had been averted. But Jamal did not smile back. His eyes were completely dead, devoid of any warmth or affection. "Thank you, Chloe." Jamal continued, each word dropping like a block of solid ice into the silent hall. "Thank you for introducing me to the fascinating, complex world of forensic accounting." Chloe's artificial smile instantly froze. The color began to drain from her cheeks, leaving her designer blush looking stark and unnatural against her suddenly ashen skin. Marcus jerked his head upward, staring at his son as if Jamal had just spoken in a foreign language. "You see," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that somehow made it even more menacing. "If it were not for you, I never would have thought to run a comprehensive credit check on myself the moment I turned 18. If it were not for your sheer, unadulterated greed, I never would have discovered that you and my father quietly used my social security number to open 6 different high-limit credit cards in my name." A sharp collective gasp echoed through the massive auditorium. It was a visceral sound of pure shock. The wealthy investors sitting 2 rows behind Marcus physically recoiled, their faces twisting with sudden, sharp disgust. In their elite circle, ruthless business tactics were one thing, but stealing a child's identity was an unforgivable, grotesque violation of the social contract. Down on the stage, the row of school board members and distinguished faculty sitting behind Jamal looked completely horrified. The principal's jaw literally dropped, his hands, gripping his knees as he stared at the back of Jamal's head, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the scandal unfolding at his prestigious commencement ceremony. But Jamal was not finished. He leaned even closer to the microphone, refusing to let them breathe. "And I certainly never would have found out," Jamal enunciated every single syllable with razor-sharp precision, "that you spent the last 2 years systematically siphoning exactly $250,000 out of my college savings fund. A fund that my real mother bled to build by working back-to-back night shifts for over a decade. You drained my future just to illegally bail out a debt-drowning beauty studio that has not turned a single cent of profit since the day it opened its doors." The silence in the room shattered into a million pieces. The auditorium erupted into absolute chaos. The polite, hushed atmosphere of the Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy commencement was instantly obliterated by a tidal wave of outrage, loud murmurs, and shocked exclamations. Elite parents were leaning over their seats, whispering frantically to one another, their eyes wide with disbelief as they pointed directly at the VIP section. Chloe let out a strangled, breathless sound. The expensive smartphone she had been holding to record the ceremony slipped from her trembling fingers and crashed onto the polished hardwood floor, the screen shattering loudly. But she did not even look down. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, as she stared at the stage in absolute unmitigated terror. The luxurious pastel dress she had flaunted earlier now looked like a cheap costume. The heavy realization that she was facing imminent criminal charges, broadcasted live to the wealthiest and most influential people in the city, had completely broken her. Marcus stood up, but his legs seemed to lack all bone and muscle. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the inevitable detonation. He opened his mouth, raising a shaking hand toward the stage, as if he could somehow physically stop the words from leaving his son's mouth. But no sound came out. He was trapped, cornered like a rat in the glare of 1,000 judging eyes. The bank executives he had spent the entire morning desperately trying to network with were now actively turning their backs to him, looking at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. His career, his reputation, and his freedom were disintegrating in real time. Directly behind them, Brad and Tasha were practically crawling over each other, trying to escape the blast radius. Brad had pulled his jacket up over his face, completely abandoning his puffed-out aggressive posture from earlier, terrified that someone would take a picture and associate him with this monumental fraud. Tasha was weeping silently, grabbing her designer bag and pushing past the knees of the appalled parents sitting next to her, desperate to flee the auditorium before the police arrived. Jamal stood tall amidst the uproar. He did not flinch. He did not step back. He waited patiently for the wave of shocked murmurs to slightly recede before delivering the final fatal blow. "So truly, I want to say thank you to both of you," Jamal said, his voice soaring over the chaotic noise of the crowd, ringing with a fierce, triumphant power. "Because if you had not committed multiple felonies against your own son, if you had not forced me to spend the last 6 months tracing your pathetic, sloppy shell companies and handing a perfectly compiled binder of evidence over to the district attorney, I would have never discovered my true passion for criminal law." The crowd went wild. It was no longer just shock. It was a roaring, spontaneous explosion of vindication and applause. Parents were standing up, completely abandoning their polite decorum, cheering for the sheer bravery of this 18-year-old boy who had just dismantled his abusers on the biggest stage of his life. From my vantage point at the very back of the auditorium, the entire scene played out like a cinematic masterpiece. The long, shadowy aisle stretched out before me, leading straight down to the brightly lit stage, perfectly framing the utter destruction of my ex-husband's life. I did not move from the exit doors. I simply stood there, feeling an overwhelming, bone-deep sense of satisfaction radiating through my entire body. I watched Chloe bury her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as the people around her actively moved their chairs away from her. I watched Marcus completely collapse back into his seat, a broken, ruined man, realizing that his own greed had just signed his prison sentence. And then I looked past them. I looked up at the stage, past the shocked faculty and the cheering students, and locked eyes with my son. Jamal stood proudly behind the podium, the bright stage lights catching the fierce, unyielding intelligence in his eyes. He looked over the heads of the chaotic crowd, looking straight to the back of the room, where I stood in the shadows. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Jamal's face. It was a smile of pure victory, of shared understanding, of an unbreakable bond forged in sacrifice and survival. I smiled back. I slowly uncrossed my arms and gave him a single proud nod. They had told me to stand in the back because they thought I did not belong. But as I watched the police officers quietly enter the side doors of the auditorium, moving purposefully toward the VIP section, I realized that the back of the room had provided the absolute best view of the show. The collective gasp of the Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy elite had barely dissipated when the raw, unfiltered reality of Jamal's words finally penetrated Marcus's thick skull. The absolute silence that had gripped the auditorium shattered into a million jagged pieces. For a fraction of a second, Marcus remained frozen in his stolen velvet chair, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The illusion of his wealth, his meticulously curated control, and his entire identity simply evaporated under the blinding stage lights. Then his brain short-circuited. He went from a smug financial director to a cornered, frantic animal in the blink of an eye. Marcus let out a guttural, furious roar that tore through the refined atmosphere of the hall. He lunged forward violently, shoving the heavy velvet chair backward. It crashed into the knees of the prominent city judge sitting directly behind him, but Marcus did not even register the collision. He scrambled over the polished wooden barricade separating the VIP section from the main aisle, moving with a jerky, unhinged desperation. His tailored suit jacket caught on the brass railing, ripping at the seam, but he kept tearing forward. He was sprinting blindly toward the stage, his face contorted into a mask of pure, humiliated rage. He was going to grab the microphone. He was going to physically silence his own son. "You shut your mouth!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria, completely shedding his refined persona. "Shut your mouth right now, I am your father." He hit the carpeted steps leading up to the stage, his leather shoes slipping frantically, but he never made it past the second step. Before the hired event, security could even unclip their radios. Two fathers from the front row intercepted him. These were not ordinary men. They were the very titans of industry Marcus had spent the entire morning desperately trying to network with. A towering tech CEO and a broad-shouldered orthopedic surgeon moved with terrifying speed. They grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his ruined suit and physically slammed him backward against the heavy oak banister of the stage stairs. "Get your hands off me!" Marcus thrashed wildly, his expensive cologne now mixed with the sour stench of pure panic. "Let me go. He is lying. The boy is lying. You need to calm down and step back," the surgeon commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute icy authority. He twisted his grip on Marcus's collar, pinning him firmly in place. The unbridled disgust in the wealthy man's eyes was absolute. In their elite circle, ruthless business tactics were expected, but stealing a child's identity to fund a fake lifestyle was a grotesque, unforgivable violation of the social contract. You are making an absolute fool of yourself, and you will not take another step toward that stage. 4 uniformed security guards finally converged on the stairs, grabbing Marcus by his arms and dragging him backward. He kicked and struggled, his polished shoes scuffing the floor, looking entirely pathetic as he was manhandled away from the spotlight. Down in the audience, the chaos was mutating. With Marcus physically neutralized, the sheer panic infected his sister. Tasha leaped to her feet. Her carefully styled hair was plastered to her sweaty forehead. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically around the cavernous, roaring auditorium like a trapped bird. She needed a target. She desperately needed a scapegoat to deflect the crushing weight of the public humiliation crashing down upon her family. She spun around, her frantic gaze sweeping the shadows at the very back of the hall. The bright exit signs illuminated my face perfectly. I was standing exactly where she had tried to banish me. My arms casually crossed over my chest, watching their destruction with total, unwavering serenity. Tasha's face twisted into an ugly, hateful snarl. She pointed a trembling finger straight at me, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical screech that managed to cut through the deafening murmur of the crowd. "This is your fault," Tasha shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the high ceilings. She stepped out into the aisle, screaming toward the back of the room, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. "You poisonous, manipulative trash. You put him up to this. You brainwashed that boy. You could not stand that. My brother leveled up, so you brought your ghetto drama here to ruin us. You are evil." The surrounding parents physically recoiled from her, pulling their expensive coats and bags away, as if her hysteria were a contagious disease. I did not flinch. I did not uncross my arms. I did not even bother to raise my voice to defend myself. I simply stared back at her, letting her completely unravel in front of the wealthiest people in the city. Her desperate screams were the flailings of a drowning woman, and I was not about to throw her a life preserver. Before Tasha could take another aggressive step up the aisle, a sharp, rhythmic sound sliced through the chaos. Tap, tap, tap. The heavy amplified thumping echoed through the massive speakers, followed by a sharp, piercing squeal of microphone feedback that made half the auditorium cover their ears. The crowd instantly hushed their attention, snapping violently back to the stage. Jamal had not moved an inch. He stood perfectly still behind the heavy wooden podium, a commanding, solitary figure bathed in the golden stage lights. He leaned down, bringing his mouth incredibly close to the microphone. His eyes locked onto his aunt, his expression terrifying in its cold, absolute composure. "Do not blame my mother. Aunt Tasha." Jamal's voice rolled over the crowd, deep and resonant, entirely devoid of the panic currently consuming his father's family. "My mother taught me how to read a balance sheet. She taught me how to demand my own credit reports. She taught me how to recognize when the people who are supposed to protect you are actually bleeding you dry. The investigation into the fraudulent accounts opened under my social security number was initiated entirely by me." Tasha froze in the aisle, her arms still extended, her mouth hanging open in stunned silence. "You can scream all you want," Jamal continued his words, falling like heavy stones into the breathless auditorium. "You can call her every name in the book to make yourself feel better about the fact that your brother is a thief. But all the screaming and all the fake family honor in the world does not pay off federal fraud debts. It does not erase wire fraud. And it certainly does not stop the district attorney from pressing felony charges." The invocation of federal fraud and the district attorney hit the room like a physical shockwave. The murmurs erupted again, louder and more vicious this time. The wealthy elite of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy were ruthless. They loved a scandal provided it did not involve them. Dozens of smartphones were suddenly raised high in the air. The bright flashing lights of camera lenses illuminated the panicked faces of Marcus and his family. The modern equivalent of torches and pitchforks had been drawn. They were recording every second of this spectacular downfall, ensuring that the total social and professional execution of Marcus Harrison would be permanent and widely distributed by dinner time. The graduation ceremony had officially, irreversibly broken down. Principal Sterling was gripping the edges of his own chair on the stage, his face pale, utterly failing to restore any semblance of order. He signaled frantically to the stagehands to cut the microphone, but they were too paralyzed by the unfolding drama to move. Down in the VIP section, Chloe had completely collapsed onto the floor. She was on her hands and knees between the velvet chairs, weeping hysterically, her expensive pastel dress bunching up around her waist as she blindly attempted to crawl away from the flashing cameras. She looked utterly pathetic, a woman who had tried to build a kingdom on stolen sand, now drowning in the tide of her own consequences. The security guards were aggressively hauling Marcus backward down the side aisle toward the emergency exits. He had stopped fighting physically, but he was sobbing now, a loud, ugly sound of total defeat. His tailored suit was ruined, his tie ripped askew, his pristine image thoroughly eradicated. Brad had grabbed Tasha by the arm, violently jerking her backward. He dragged his hysterical wife toward the side doors, keeping his head down, using his free hand to shield his face from the relentless glare of the recording cell phones. They were fleeing the wreckage, leaving their unearned arrogance crushed beneath the polished shoes of the high society they had worshipped. Jamal stood at the podium for one final moment, surveying the absolute devastation he had unleashed upon the people who had tried to steal his future. He did not look angry anymore. He looked incredibly, beautifully free. He stepped back from the microphone, leaving the shredded pieces of his fake speech scattered across the stage floor. He adjusted the cuffs of his Tom Ford suit, turned his back on the chaos, and walked calmly toward the wings. I turned around and pushed open the heavy brass doors leading out to the main lobby. The bright, warm sunlight streaming through the massive glass windows hit my face, and I took a deep, cleansing breath of fresh air. The roaring chaos of the auditorium was muffled as the heavy doors swung shut behind me. I walked out to the main courtyard to wait for my son, knowing with absolute certainty that our new life had just officially begun. I barely had a moment to breathe the fresh air before the heavy side door of the auditorium slammed open. Jamal stepped out, shedding the stifling navy blue graduation gown to reveal the sharp, immaculate lines of his suit. He looked victorious. His shoulders relaxed, a profound weight lifted from his spirit. But our moment of triumph was violently and immediately interrupted. Before we could reach the open expanse of the main courtyard, we were forced to navigate a narrow wood-paneled corridor that connected the Performing Arts Center to the main administrative building. It was a claustrophobic bottleneck, and our enemies knew it. Suddenly, the path ahead was blocked. Marcus, Chloe, Tasha, and Brad materialized from an adjoining hallway, forming a desperate, pathetic barricade across the narrow passage. The physical space instantly shrank, the air growing thick, hot, and suffocating. My eyes darted rapidly between them, taking in the frantic, erratic energy radiating from the group. Tasha was pacing like a caged animal, her heels clicking aggressively against the tile. Brad was shifting his weight from foot to foot, trying to look imposing. And Marcus looked absolutely unhinged. His expensive silk tie was completely undone, his tailored suit rumpled and sweat-stained, his eyes wild, bloodshot, and darting around the confined space. Marcus did not launch into a tearful apology. He did not drop to his knees and beg his son for forgiveness. Instead, his narcissistic survival instincts kicked into overdrive, and he immediately went on the offensive. He lunged forward, closing the distance until he was inches from Jamal's face, his finger jabbing furiously into the air between them. "Are you completely out of your damn mind?" Marcus spat, a fine mist of saliva flying from his trembling lips. His voice bounced aggressively off the narrow walls, creating a dizzying echo. "You think you did something heroic in there? You think you are some kind of martyr? You just destroyed your own family." I instinctively stepped forward to shield my son, but Jamal held up a steady hand, his face a mask of absolute stone. He was perfectly content to let his father dig his own grave. "It was just a temporary loan," Marcus barked, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. He threw his hands up in a gesture of mocked exasperation, aggressively attempting to shift the reality of his crimes. "I am your father. I brought you into this world, and I have every legal and moral right to borrow from those funds to invest in our future. I was the one securing a legacy for you. I was going to pay it back with interest the moment that beauty studio turned a profit. You had no right to go snooping through private financial documents like some ungrateful, sneaking little spy." It was textbook pathological gaslighting. Marcus was desperately trying to rewrite reality, in real time, genuinely expecting Jamal to accept this twisted, sickening narrative. He wanted his son to believe that stealing $250,000 and committing identity fraud was just standard parental wealth management, a burden of leadership that Jamal was simply too immature to comprehend. "You arrogant, selfish little brat," Marcus hissed, stepping even closer, trying to physically intimidate a son who was now looking down at him. "You have no idea how the real world works. I had 3 major investors sitting right behind me in that auditorium. Men who were going to back my new brokerage firm. And you just cut off my livelihood. You publicly humiliated me and severed my funding because you were throwing a childish temper tantrum over a perfectly normal family financial arrangement. You ruined us." Before Jamal could even respond to this spectacular stomach-churning display of manipulation, Chloe launched her own calculated counterattack. Seeing a few affluent parents trickling out of the nearby restroom and pausing at the end of the hallway to watch the commotion, she instantly weaponized her tears. She dramatically collapsed against the oak-paneled wall, her face buried in her manicured hands, her shoulders heaving with loud theatrical sobs. It was the classic, deeply insidious performance of the fragile, helpless victim, perfectly timed to garner sympathy from the wealthy white onlookers gathering at the periphery of our confrontation. "I tried so hard," Chloe wailed, making sure her shrill voice carried all the way down the corridor. "I tried everything to love him. I welcomed him into our beautiful home. I tried to be a real mother to him when his own family failed him." She looked up, her expensive mascara running in dark rivers down her cheeks, her eyes frantically seeking validation from the strangers at the end of the hall. Then she raised a trembling hand and pointed her finger directly at me. "But she wouldn't let us be a family!" Chloe cried out, her voice pitching into a hysterical, piercing shriek. "This bitter, angry black woman has been poisoning his mind against us since day one. She could not stand that Marcus moved on and found true happiness. She could not stand that we were successful and wealthy, so she brainwashed this poor, confused boy into destroying his own father. We are the innocent victims here. She won't leave us alone." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her performance was almost paralyzing. She was attempting to use every societal stereotype, every manipulative racist trope available to her, painting me as the angry, jealous ex-wife and herself as the innocent, persecuted martyr. She desperately wanted the wealthy onlookers to see a savage, unprovoked attack on her pristine life rather than the undeniable exposure of her federal crimes. She wept louder, sliding down the wall, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Tasha, emboldened by Chloe's sickening performance, stepped around her brother and glared at me with absolute unfiltered venom. She pointed her finger just inches from my face. "You are sick in the head," Tasha sneered, her voice vibrating with raw malice. "You put him up to this. You fed him those lies because you are a pathetic, miserable failure. You are a wicked, jealous woman who just ruined my brother's life because you could never keep him yourself. You completely brainwashed that boy. You are evil." Brad puffed out his chest, stepping up beside Tasha, trying to loom over me in the confined space, a hollow, pathetic attempt to physically enforce their crumbling web of lies. The dynamic in the hallway was a suffocating, fast-paced assault on the senses. The camera of my mind snapped rapidly between them. Marcus's unhinged, aggressive gaslighting, Chloe's loud, performative wailing, Tasha's venomous accusations, and Brad's cowardly posturing. They were trying to drown us in their manufactured chaos, hoping that if they screamed loudly enough, the truth would simply disappear. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match their hysteria. I just stood there breathing evenly, watching them flail in the terrifying trap of their own making. Jamal remained perfectly still. He looked at his father, his stepmother, and his aunt, with an expression of profound, chilling emptiness. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen, once activating the voice memo application he had been using to record the entire confrontation, and held it up between them. He tapped his index finger sharply against the microphone of the phone. Tap, tap. "Do not blame my mother," Aunt Tasha, Jamal said. His voice was not raised, but the icy, unyielding authority in his tone instantly cut through the screaming and the fake sobs, freezing the entire group in their tracks. He spoke directly into the phone's microphone, ensuring every single word was captured with crystal clarity. "She did not brainwash me, and she certainly did not force you to commit fraud," Jamal continued, his eyes locking onto Marcus. "Family honor and loud tantrums do not pay off federal fraud debts. Your pathetic attempts at gaslighting might work on yourselves, but they do not work on me, and they certainly do not work on the Internal Revenue Service." Marcus's mouth snapped shut. Chloe's fake sobs choked off into a terrified hiccup. "You can stand in this hallway and scream about temporary loans and bitter ex-wives until you are blue in the face," Jamal said, stepping forward, forcing Marcus to take a clumsy step backward. "But the financial records do not lie. The forged signatures on the credit applications do not lie. You stole $250,000 from your own son to fund a failing vanity project, and now you are going to pay the price. The district attorney already has the digital footprint of every single transaction." Jamal lowered the phone, his gaze sweeping over the pathetic, ruined group blocking our path. "This graduation ceremony is officially over," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "And so is your freedom. Move out of our way." The fight completely drained out of Marcus. He looked at the recording phone in Jamal's hand, the reality of his impending arrest finally overriding his narcissistic delusions. He stumbled backward, bumping into Brad, clearing the path. Tasha clamped her mouth shut, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized her own complicity might be under investigation. Chloe remained slumped against the wall, staring blankly at the floor, the realization that her life of luxury was over finally sinking in. Jamal did not wait for them to say another word. He straightened his jacket, held his head high, and walked straight through the gap they had created in their barricade. I followed closely behind him, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor, leaving Marcus, Chloe, Tasha, and Brad to face the devastating, inescapable ruins of their own making. The camera shifts into a dramatic Dutch angle, tilting upward from a low, jagged position to capture the sudden explosive aggression radiating from the side of the corridor. We did not even have the chance to take 3 steps past the broken remains of Marcus's ego before Brad broke his cowardly silence. Sensing that his own precious social standing was dissolving in real time, the real estate broker completely snapped. He lunged forward, his heavy leather shoes stomping against the floor, physically throwing his broad frame directly into our path. He cut off the exit to the main courtyard, his chest puffed out in a desperate, hyper-aggressive display of white-collar dominance. Brad thrust his hand forward, his thick, trembling index finger hovering barely an inch away from my face. The tilted lens captures the raw, ugly fury twisting his features, making him look bloated and monstrous under the harsh fluorescent lights of the administrative hallway. "You listen to me, you vindictive, crazy woman!" Brad roared, his voice shaking with a volatile mixture of panic and unadulterated malice. "You think you and your little bastard child are clever. You think you can just stand up there and broadcast fabricated lies to the Board of Trustees and get away with it. I have the most elite, expensive legal team in the entire state of Connecticut on retainer. By tomorrow morning, I am filing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against both of you for defamation, slander, and intentional tortious interference with business relations." He leaned down, his face turning a dark, mottled red as he tried to use his height to crush my composure. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed violently off the tight drywall of the narrow corridor, making sure the remaining parents lingering near the restrooms could hear every single word. "You think you can play games with us, Nia?" Brad sneered, his eyes bulging as he spit the words out. "Look at you. You are nothing but a penniless former night shift nurse. You spent the last decade emptying bedpans and wiping up fluids for a meager hourly wage. Do you honestly think you have the financial resources to handle a protracted legal battle? Do you think you can afford to sit in a deposition room for 10 hours a day while my lawyers strip away whatever pathetic little savings you have left? You will be bankrupted before the preliminary hearing even starts. You and your son will be living out of your car by the time I am done with you." The camera immediately cuts to a perfectly level, steady, eye-level shot, stabilizing the frame completely as the focus locks onto my face. The chaotic, frantic tilt of Brad's aggression is instantly neutralized by the absolute icy stillness of my demeanor. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward away from his pointing finger. Instead, a slow, deep chuckle started in the back of my throat, eventually breaking out into a clear, resonant laugh that echoed beautifully through the claustrophobic hallway. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated amusement, the sound of a woman who held every single winning card in the deck watching an amateur try to bluff with a pair of twos. I stepped forward, closing the distance until Brad was forced to instinctively tilt his head back. I leaned in close, my voice dropping to a low conversational whisper that was completely calm, yet heavy with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "Are you absolutely sure you want to call your high-priced legal team, Brad?" I asked, my eyes locked onto his twitching eyelids. "Because if I were you, I would be using that retainer to secure a top-tier federal criminal defense attorney instead." Brad's aggressive posture instantly faltered. The sneer on his face froze, his Belova watch-clad hand hovering awkwardly in midair as his brain tried to process the sudden shift in gravity. "What the hell are you talking about?" Brad stammered, his voice losing its booming resonance, dropping an octave into a defensive, fragile register. I smiled, my gaze dropping to his trembling hand before snapping back up to his eyes. "You see, Brad, when Jamal and I spent the last 6 months tracing the digital footprint of the $250,000 that Marcus stole from our son's college fund, we did not just look at bank transfers. We looked at the asset legitimization process. We looked at how a failing, debt-drowned beauty studio with zero revenue suddenly managed to secure a massive commercial bridge loan from a traditional banking institution. I took another step, forcing Brad to retreat, until his back pressed firmly against the solid oak door of the administrative office. The eye-level camera tracks the movement with clinical, suffocating precision. "We found the shell companies, Brad," I continued, my voice smooth and deadly. "And more importantly, we found the fraudulent asset appraisals and the fabricated corporate financial reports that were used to legitimize those sham entities to the lenders. Do you want to guess whose corporate stamp was on every single one of those fraudulent real estate valuations? Do you want to guess which boutique real estate brokerage firm officially signed off on the phantom equity of that beauty studio to help Marcus hide the siphoned cash? It was your firm, Brad. Your signature is on the federal loan applications as the certifying broker. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if all the air had been violently sucked out of Brad's lungs. The unbridled aggressive arrogance vanished from his face, replaced by a stark, unmitigated terror. A thick bead of sweat formed at his hairline, breaking loose and tracing a slow, wet path through his heavy foundation makeup down to his jawline. His forehead became instantly drenched, the collar of his expensive dress shirt darkening as pure panic took physical hold of his body. He looked down at me, his chest heaving as he completely suffocated under the weight of his own criminal exposure. Directly behind him, Tasha took a slow, staggering step backward. Her high heels clipped the baseboard with a sharp crack, but she barely noticed. She stared at her husband's damp, trembling face, her own cheeks draining of all color, until her designer blush looked like a grotesque painted scar against her white skin. For 2 years, she had bragged to the entire extended family about Brad's brilliant real estate maneuvers, about the executive bonuses, about the luxury vehicles, and the effortless wealth they were accumulating. She had genuinely believed her husband was a financial mastermind. Now, watching him disintegrate into a puddle of sweat and terror in a narrow school hallway, the horrific truth finally pierced through her vanity. Brad was not a genius broker. He was a white-collar co-conspirator. He had actively used his licensed business to mask her brother's felony identity theft and fraud against an 18-year-old boy. They were not just facing a messy family squabble or a social snub at a preparatory academy. They were facing total professional decimation, a complete asset freeze, and a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Brad opened his mouth to speak, to launch into another defensive lie, but no sound came out. His throat was completely dry, his vocal cords paralyzed by the absolute destruction of his life. He was trapped, caught in the level, unyielding glare of a former night shift nurse who had quietly spent her lonely hours compiling an ironclad binder of financial devastation. Jamal stood beside me, his tall frame casting a long, commanding shadow over the ruined couple. He adjusted his graduation watch, looked at his uncle with total indifference, and spoke with finality. "The moving trucks are already scheduled for your office on Monday, Brad," Jamal said, his deep voice dropping the final hammer. "The real estate board has already been notified of the pending indictment. I suggest you go find your wife's brother and figure out how you are going to share a cell block." We did not wait for a response. I turned my back on their silent, sweating ruin, and we walked out into the blinding sunlight of the main courtyard, leaving the shattered pieces of the Harrison family name to rot in the shadows of the corridor. The heavy brass doors of the administrative building had barely swung shut behind us when they were violently thrown open again, striking the exterior brick wall with a deafening metallic crack. We had not even made it halfway across the sunlit courtyard. Marcus charged out into the blinding daylight, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his polished high society persona. His desperation had finally mutated into a blind, feral rage. He could not accept being walked away from. He could not tolerate losing absolute control of the narrative, especially to the woman he had spent the last decade trying to make feel small and insignificant. "You arrogant, vindictive bitch," Marcus roared, his voice tearing raw from his throat. He sprinted across the concrete pavers, his expensive leather shoes slapping hard against the ground. "You think you can just orchestrate this entire circus? Destroy my livelihood? Ruin my family's reputation and just walk away?" He closed the distance between us with terrifying speed. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, the veins in his neck bulging against his sweat-soaked collar. He completely bypassed Jamal, his furious eyes locking entirely onto me. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, his teenage son was incapable of pulling off this masterpiece of a takedown. To Marcus, I had to be the mastermind. I had to be the one who weaponized Jamal against him. "You ruined everything," Marcus screamed, stepping directly into my personal space. He drew his arm back, his hand curling into a rigid, trembling palm, preparing to strike me directly across the face with all the humiliated fury he possessed. He never even came close to making contact. Before I could even register the physical threat, Jamal moved with the speed and precision of a coiled spring snapping loose. He stepped squarely between us, his broad shoulders instantly shielding me from Marcus's line of sight. Jamal did not just block the blow, he caught Marcus's descending wrist in mid-air. The loud smack of flesh hitting flesh echoed sharply across the quiet courtyard. Jamal's grip was absolute iron. He did not flinch. He did not blink. He stood several inches taller than his father, and in that singular frozen moment, the physical and moral power dynamic of their entire relationship was permanently inverted. "Do not ever," Jamal commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave that vibrated with suppressed rage, "attempt to raise your hand to my mother again." Marcus gasped, his eyes widening in sudden, sharp shock as he tried and utterly failed to wrench his wrist free from his son's crushing grip. Jamal held him there for 3 agonizing seconds, letting Marcus fully comprehend his own physical and emotional impotence before violently shoving his father's arm away in disgust. Marcus stumbled backward, his polished shoes skidding on the concrete, nearly tripping over his own feet as he frantically tried to maintain his balance. Right on cue, the heavy brass doors opened again. Chloe, Tasha, and Brad stumbled out into the sunlight, squinting against the glare. They had followed Marcus out, likely hoping to see him finally put me in my place, hoping to salvage some pathetic scrap of dominance from the wreckage of the afternoon. Instead, they walked out just in time to witness Marcus being effortlessly physically overpowered by the son he had defrauded. Brad immediately puffed out his chest, stepping forward to back up his brother-in-law. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger at Jamal. "You are going to regret putting your hands on him, boy." Brad barked, his voice laced with false bravado, as he desperately tried to resurrect his earlier threat. "You think you are so smart? You think a binder full of printed bank statements makes you a legal expert? My attorneys are going to bury you and your mother in so much civil litigation you will not be able to afford the clothes on your backs. We are going to sue you for defamation, for slander, and for corporate sabotage. You are done." Jamal did not even look at Brad. He kept his cold, dead eyes locked entirely on his father. Slowly, deliberately, Jamal reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. Looking over Jamal's broad shoulder, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the bright screen. He tapped the display to wake it up, his thumb swiping upward to bypass the lock screen. He opened his email application and navigated directly to his sent folder. He turned the phone around, thrusting the glowing screen directly into Marcus's sweating face. "You do not need to bother calling your high-priced legal team Uncle Brad," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with a terrifying, absolute serenity. "Civil litigation is for people who are arguing over hurt feelings and breached contracts. You do not need civil defense attorneys. You need federal criminal defense attorneys." Marcus squinted at the screen, his breath hitching audibly as his eyes frantically scanned the text. "What is this?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling so violently the words barely formed. "That is the final nail in your coffin," Jamal enunciated every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "That is a sent email. I drafted it late last night. I attached every single piece of evidence I spent the last 6 months compiling, and I hit send the exact moment I stepped down from that commencement stage." Jamal took a step forward, forcing Marcus to read the recipient list aloud in his own mind. "I did not just send this to the local district attorney," Jamal explained, his tone conversational, yet heavy with impending doom. "I CC'd the regional director of the Internal Revenue Service. I CC'd the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. I CC'd the State Real Estate Licensing Board." Behind Marcus, Brad let out a strangled, breathless sound, sounding exactly like a man who had just been violently punched in the stomach. "I gave them everything," Jamal continued, his voice soaring over the stunned silence of the courtyard. I gave them the complete unredacted history of the shell companies you set up using my social security number. I gave them the falsified corporate tax returns you filed to hide the cash flow. I gave them Uncle Brad's fraudulent real estate appraisal forms, complete with his digital signature, which were used to illegally secure the commercial bridge loan for the beauty studio. Tasha let out a sharp, hysterical gasp. She turned to look at her husband, her eyes wide with absolute unmitigated horror. Brad was no longer puffing out his chest. He was hyperventilating, his hands clutching his own hair as he backed away from the group, staring at Jamal's phone as if it were a live explosive device. The realization that his entire lucrative career, his license and his freedom, had just been permanently eradicated by an 18-year-old boy was causing him to physically malfunction. But Jamal was not finished. He turned his piercing gaze toward Chloe, who was standing slightly behind Marcus, her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist. And Chloe, Jamal said, his voice dripping with icy contempt, "I made sure to include a very special, highly detailed spreadsheet just for you." Chloe flinched, taking a small, terrified step backward. "What spreadsheet?" She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "The one that perfectly cross-references the exact dates my father illegally siphoned thousands of dollars out of my college savings account, with the exact dates you purchased your Cartier watches, your Birkin bags, and your custom Tesla," Jamal replied, watching with cold satisfaction as the remaining color completely drained from her heavily made-up face. "I provided the IRS with the serial numbers of the luxury goods and the corresponding fraudulent wire transfers. They are not just going to audit the beauty studio. They are going to seize every single asset you purchased with stolen funds. Your entire designer life is currently logged as federal evidence." The villains were completely, triply petrified. The dynamic in the sunlit courtyard had shifted from a frantic, aggressive confrontation into a scene of absolute, silent devastation. They were no longer trying to intimidate us. They were no longer trying to gaslight us or scream about their wealth. They were paralyzed, trapped in a suffocating nightmare of their own making, fully realizing that the walls were rapidly closing in around them, and there was absolutely no escape. Marcus stared at the sent timestamp on the phone screen. The time read perfectly. The email had been delivered to the federal authorities exactly 20 minutes ago. The wheels of justice were already turning. The investigations were already open. The audits were already pending. His entire existence, his pristine credit score, his country club memberships, his tailored suits, and his arrogant sense of superiority had been utterly vaporized by a single click of his son's thumb. Marcus dropped to his knees. It was not a dramatic, performative collapse like Chloe's earlier display in the hallway. It was a total failure of his nervous system. His legs simply stopped working. He hit the concrete hard, tearing the fabric of his trousers, his head bowing down toward the pavement. He did not scream. He did not cry. He just knelt there in the bright sunlight, staring blankly at the ground, a hollow, empty shell of a man waiting for the federal authorities to come and collect the remains. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled, terrified keen as she stared down at her ruined husband. She slowly sank down onto the pavement beside him, pulling her knees to her chest, her luxurious lifestyle dissolving into ash before her very eyes. Tasha was openly weeping now, violently hitting Brad on the shoulder, screaming at him for getting them involved. But Brad did not even react. He just stood there staring blankly at the brick wall of the school, his mind completely broken by the reality of his impending federal indictment. Jamal slowly lowered his phone and slid it back into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He looked down at the pathetic, sobbing group of adults huddled on the concrete. He did not look angry. He did not look vindictive. He just looked incredibly, profoundly exhausted by their existence. "Do not try to contact us," Jamal said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "Do not call. Do not text. Just go home and wait for the knock on the door." He turned around and looked at me. The fierce, terrifying intensity in his eyes melted away, replaced by a soft, exhausted warmth. He offered me his arm. "Let's go home, Mom," he said gently. I smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached all the way to my soul. I looped my arm through his, feeling the solid, reassuring strength of the remarkable young man I had raised. We turned our backs on the wreckage of the Harrison family. We did not rush. We walked slowly and deliberately across the beautiful sunlit courtyard, our heads held high, leaving them to drown in the suffocating silence of their own inevitable destruction. Sitting in my quiet living room, the morning sun filtering through the sheer curtains, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my chamomile tea. The porcelain cup was warm against my palms, a comforting contrast to the cold, clinical precision with which my son and I had dismantled Marcus Harrison's life. Ordinary people, when faced with the absolute certainty of a federal indictment, would hire a lawyer, bow their heads, and prepare for the worst. But Marcus was not an ordinary man. He was a narcissist of the highest order. For a man whose entire existence was built on the fragile scaffolding of public perception, admitting defeat was a fate worse than death. A cornered narcissist does not surrender to reality. They double down on the illusion. 2 nights after the commencement ceremony, Marcus attempted to execute the most pathetic, desperate flex of his entirely fabricated life. Despite the fact that the IRS had already frozen his primary bank accounts and the FBI was actively securing warrants for his office computers, Marcus decided he needed to project an aura of untouchable wealth. He needed to convince his remaining highly skeptical business partners that the scandal at the high school was nothing more than a hysterical, exaggerated misunderstanding. To do this, he chose Le Ciel. Le Ciel was the most obscenely expensive, exclusive French restaurant in the city. It was the kind of establishment that did not list prices on the menu, required a strict dress code, and demanded reservations 6 months in advance. Marcus arrived with a desperate, sweating entourage. Chloe was draped in a frantic assembly of designer labels, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent lobby, desperately trying to look like a woman who was not on the verge of losing her custom Tesla. Tasha clung to Brad, who looked as though he had not slept in a week. Brad's skin carried a sickly grayish pallor, his usual arrogant swagger replaced by the rigid posture of a man waiting for a sniper's bullet. Rounding out the group were 3 high-profile investors. Marcus had managed to scrape together men he desperately needed to fund his mounting legal defense and keep his sinking ship afloat. Marcus strode up to the maitre d's podium, projecting a loud artificial boom in his voice. He made sure the investors and anyone else within earshot heard every single word of his performance. "We have the Monarch 5 COIP room reserved," Marcus announced, tossing his platinum credit card onto the polished marble stand with an arrogant flick of his wrist. "And listen to me carefully. I have an estranged, deeply unstable ex-wife named Nia and a troubled son named Jamal. If either of them attempts to enter this establishment tonight, you are to deny them entry immediately. If they cause a scene, I want you to call the police and have them arrested for trespassing. We are conducting highly sensitive business tonight and cannot tolerate their ghetto disruptions." The maitre d', a tall, impeccably dressed man with a perfectly neutral expression, did not even blink. He simply offered a crisp, professional bow, left the platinum card sitting untouched on the marble stand, and picked up a stack of leather-bound menus. He gestured toward the heavy, soundproof oak doors at the back of the restaurant. "Right this way, Mr. Harrison." Marcus puffed out his chest, adjusting his suit jacket, offering a smug, reassuring smile to the investors standing behind him. He reached out and pushed open the heavy double doors to the Monarch room, ready to step into his sanctuary of power, wealth, and delusion. The doors swung wide, revealing the breathtaking, dimly lit private dining room. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the massive mahogany table set with fine china and imported silver. But the room was not empty. Jamal and I were already sitting at the very head of the table. I was casually swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux, the dark red liquid catching the chandelier light. Jamal was sitting to my right, perfectly relaxed, finishing a piece of seared filet mignon. We looked completely at home, radiating a quiet, terrifying sovereignty that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the room. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. The smug smile slid off his face so fast, it looked as though the muscles in his jaw had physically snapped. Chloe let out a sharp, audible gasp, bumping directly into Marcus's back. Brad and Tasha froze in the doorway, their eyes widening in absolute, unmitigated horror. The three investors peered over Marcus's shoulders, their brows furrowing in deep confusion. "What the hell is this?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking instantly, losing the manufactured commanding baritone he had used in the lobby. He spun around, glaring at the maitre d'. "I told you to keep them out. I told you they were not allowed in here. Call security immediately and have these trespassers thrown out on the street." The maitre d' stepped smoothly past Marcus, retrieving a silver wine bucket from a nearby stand. He walked over to my side of the table, carefully topped off my glass with the Bordeaux, and then turned to face Marcus with an expression of polite, unyielding, absolute zero. "I apologize for the confusion, Mr. Harrison," the maitre d' said smoothly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "However, I cannot ask the primary stakeholder of the parent hospitality group to leave her own establishment. Madame Nia secured the majority shares of Le Ciel Properties over 3 years ago." The absolute silence that fell over the room was heavy enough to crush bone. Marcus stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, his brain entirely incapable of processing the information. He had spent a decade convincing himself and everyone else that I was a destitute, miserable nurse who had peaked the day I married him. He needed me to be poor to validate his own fraudulent wealth. The realization that I not only possessed the financial resources to obliterate him, but actually owned the very ground he was currently standing on, broke his mind in real time. Brad began to visibly shake. He grabbed Tasha's arm, pulling her backward toward the hallway, his survival instincts finally screaming at him to flee the blast radius. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the rich, complex flavor, before setting the crystal glass down on the mahogany table. I looked directly past my ex-husband, focusing my attention entirely on the three investors standing awkwardly by the door. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting clear and calm across the room, "my name is Nia. I am the woman Marcus Harrison has been telling you is hysterical, broke, and bitter. I am also the woman who holds the complete unredacted federal dossier proving that Marcus Harrison and Brad here have systematically defrauded their clients, the IRS, and my teenage son." I picked up a thick, leather-bound folder resting next to my plate and tossed it down the length of the table. It slid perfectly across the polished wood, stopping exactly at the edge directly in front of the lead investor. Inside that folder are the tracking numbers for the frozen offshore accounts, the forged commercial loan applications, and a direct contact number for the lead FBI agent currently investigating their brokerage firm, I stated, leaning back in my chair. "You are welcome to sit down, order a drink, and review them, or you are welcome to leave. But if you sit down and break bread with Marcus Harrison tonight, my firm will personally ensure that your portfolios are permanently blacklisted from every legitimate financial institution in this city." The investors did not need to deliberate. They did not even look at Marcus. The lead investor picked up the folder, flipped it open, glanced at the first page containing the federal warrant numbers, and immediately snapped it shut. He offered me a brief, respectful nod, turned on his heel, and walked out. The other two men followed instantly, their footsteps echoing rapidly down the hallway as they fled the toxic wreckage of Marcus's life. Marcus reached out, grasping the back of a leather dining chair to keep himself from collapsing to the floor. His audience was gone. His funding was gone. His illusion of power was entirely irreversibly shattered. "You planned this," Marcus wheezed, his chest heaving as he stared at me with hollow, defeated eyes. "You bought this place just to ruin me." "I did not have to plan much, Marcus," I replied, folding my hands on the table. "You are remarkably predictable. A man who builds his entire life on lies will always run to the most expensive stage he can find when the truth comes knocking. You came here tonight to spend money you do not have to impress men who do not care about you, to hide from a reality you cannot escape. You wanted to prove you were untouchable, but you just walked into my house." I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my dress. Jamal stood up beside me, completely unbothered by the pathetic display of the man who had tried to steal his future. "Your credit card was declined at the front podium, Marcus," I informed him, watching the last shred of his dignity turn to dust. "Your accounts are frozen. The federal authorities are currently searching your property. You are trespassing in my restaurant. I suggest you take your wife, your sister, and your terrified brother-in-law and leave through the service exit before I have you physically removed by my security team." Marcus did not scream. He did not fight back. He looked at Chloe, who was silently weeping, her expensive makeup, ruined, her fantasy life destroyed. He looked at Brad and Tasha, who were already backing out the door into the hallway, desperate to escape. Slowly, brokenly, Marcus turned around and walked out, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Jamal and me in the warm golden light of the Monarch room. He did not make it 3 steps down the carpeted hallway. The sheer suffocating weight of his own bruised ego completely overrode his basic survival instincts. For a man whose entire identity was meticulously constructed around public superiority and the illusion of limitless power being dismissed by the woman he had spent a decade treating like dirt was a psychological impossibility. The reality of his defeat clashed so violently with his narcissism that his mind simply rejected it. Marcus spun around, his polished shoes skidding against the floor, and stormed right back into the Monarch room. His face was a terrifying mask of purple, frantic denial. He marched directly up to the massive mahogany table and slammed both of his fists down onto the polished wood with a deafening crack. The imported crystal wine glasses rattled violently, splashing dark red Bordeaux onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. "I am not leaving," Marcus roared, his voice tearing through the elegant, soundproofed room like a chainsaw. "You do not get to dictate terms to me. I am a VIP. In this establishment, I have spent tens of thousands of dollars in this restaurant, entertaining the elite of this city. I know the owners. I know the investors. I am a cornerstone of this community, and I will not be humiliated by a bitter, washed-up nurse playing pretend." He turned his wild, bloodshot eyes toward the doorway, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Manager, get the general manager in here right now." Behind him, Chloe, Brad, and Tasha hovered in the doorway, too terrified to fully re-enter the room, but too paralyzed by the unfolding disaster to run away. They watched Marcus flail with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. He was a drowning man demanding that the ocean apologize to him. Within seconds, the heavy oak doors swung open. The general manager of Le Ciel, a distinguished, impeccably groomed man named Henri, stepped into the room. His posture was rigid, his tailored suit flawless, his expression the epitome of high-end hospitality. Marcus immediately pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly at my face. Henri Marcus barked, his voice dripping with venomous entitlement. "Thank God you are here. I demand that you call the police and have this woman and her son physically removed from the premises immediately. She is a trespasser. She has harassed my guests. She has disrupted my private reservation, and she is completely unhinged. I want her arrested, and I want her permanently banned from this property. Do it now, or I swear to God I will personally ensure this restaurant loses its Michelin star." The dynamic in the room shifted, slowing down into a heavy, cinematic crawl. If there had been a camera circling the grand mahogany table, it would have captured the stark, breathtaking contrast in the space. On one side, Marcus was leaning over the table, sweating profusely, his tie crooked, his veins popping, his face twisted in desperate, screeching rage. On the other side, Jamal and I sat in absolute chilling stillness. We were the calm eye of the hurricane, completely unmoved by the violent winds thrashing around us. Henri did not flinch at Marcus's screaming. He did not look panicked, nor did he reach for a phone to call security. He did not even look at Marcus. Instead, Henri bypassed my ex-husband entirely. He walked with graceful, silent steps around the perimeter of the grand table, moving directly toward the head where I was seated. Marcus watched him, his mouth falling slightly open in confusion, as his demands were completely ignored. Henri stopped precisely 2 feet away from my chair. He planted his feet together, placed his hands sharply at his sides, and bent forward, bowing at a perfect, rigid 90-degree angle. He held the position for 3 full seconds, a display of absolute, unquestioning deference and profound respect. When he finally straightened up, he looked directly at me, his voice carrying clearly through the dead silence of the VIP room. Madame Henri said, his tone incredibly soft, yet carrying the weight of total submission. "Was the beef Wellington to your satisfaction today? Is there anything else the kitchen can prepare for you?" A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed from the doorway. Chloe's manicured hand flew to her chest. Brad's jaw dropped slack. Marcus froze entirely, his outstretched pointing finger slowly curling back into a trembling fist as his brain short-circuited. He looked from Henri to me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending, desperately trying to decode the impossible reality unfolding in front of him. I picked up a crisp, white linen napkin and gently dabbed the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate, leaned back into the plush leather of the dining chair, and looked up at the manager. "It was excellent," Henri first replied, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "The pastry was flawless." "Thank you. That will be all for now." Henri offered another crisp bow. "Thank you, madam." He took 2 steps backward before turning around, standing at attention near the corner of the room, completely ignoring the sweating, red-faced man standing at the other end of the table. I slowly turned my gaze back to Marcus. I watched the gears grinding in his head, watched the sheer, unadulterated panic flooding his system as the puzzle pieces finally snapped into a terrifying, devastating picture. "You forgot to update your business news, Marcus," I said. My voice was quiet, conversational, yet it struck the room with the force of a physical blow. "You spent the last decade so obsessively focused on maintaining your fake wealth, so deeply invested in your own fraudulent reflection, that you never once bothered to look at what was happening in the real world." I picked up my wine glass, swirling the dark red vintage, watching the light catch the liquid before taking a slow sip. "For the past 5 years, while you were forging signatures and stealing from your own son to buy leased sports cars and cheap country club praise, I was working." I continued, holding his terrified gaze. "I took my experience managing the night shift, analyzed the massive logistical inefficiencies in the regional medical supply chains, and built a healthcare software platform. I sold that platform 3 years ago for a very quiet, very substantial 8-figure sum. And with that capital, I built Vanguard Group." Marcus staggered backward. His knees hit the edge of a dining chair and he practically collapsed into it, staring at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. "Vanguard is a private equity firm," I explained, watching his entire worldview shatter into microscopic pieces. "We specialize in aggressive acquisitions, commercial real estate, and high-end hospitality portfolios. We do not boast. We do not buy flashy billboards. We do not throw lavish, pathetic parties to prove our worth to strangers. We simply buy the assets." And exactly 1 month ago, Vanguard Group executed a hostile takeover of the parent company that owns this restaurant chain. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table, my eyes locking onto his with predatory focus. "I own this building, Marcus. I own the chairs you are sitting on. I own the crystal glasses you just spilled. I own the very floor beneath your expensive unpaid-for shoes. You are not a VIP in this establishment. You are a broke, desperate, soon-to-be-indicted federal criminal trespassing in my house." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of total, inescapable annihilation. Marcus's face had drained of all color, his skin turning a sickly, translucent gray. The aggressive, narcissistic monster who had tormented me for years was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified shell of a man who had just realized he was standing at the absolute bottom of the food chain. He had always needed me to be a failure. He had built his entire post-divorce identity on the delusion that he was the successful, brilliant visionary who had upgraded his life while I was the miserable, stagnant weight holding him back. He needed me to be poor to justify his own existence. Now the undeniable truth was staring him in the face. He was nothing. He was a fraud, a thief, and a failure, completely outclassed, outmaneuvered, and owned by the very woman he thought he had discarded. Chloe began to sob openly in the doorway, the sound loud and pathetic in the quiet room. Her mind had finally grasped the totality of their ruin. There was no secret bank account. There was no hidden lifeline. They had insulted, threatened, and attempted to destroy a woman who possessed the financial and structural power to crush them with a single phone call. Tasha and Brad had already disappeared, silently slipping away down the corridor, abandoning Marcus and Chloe to the devastating consequences of their own arrogance. Jamal, who had been sitting quietly beside me the entire time, let out a soft, amused scoff. He looked at his father, shaking his head slowly in profound disappointment. "You should have just kept walking," Jamal said quietly. I turned my attention to the general manager, who was still standing attentively in the corner of the room. Henri Verse said, not taking my eyes off my ex-husband. Mr. Harrison and his wife have overstayed their welcome. Please have security escort them out through the rear alley exit. I do not want them upsetting the paying guests in the main dining room. Right away, Madame Henri replied smoothly. Marcus did not protest. He did not yell or threaten or try to salvage his dignity. There was absolutely nothing left to salvage. He slowly pushed himself up from the chair, his movements stiff and mechanical like a broken puppet. He did not look at me. He did not look at his son. He simply turned around, grabbed his sobbing wife by the arm, and allowed himself to be escorted out the back door, completely swallowed by the darkness he had created for himself. Marcus took his first heavy, defeated step toward the service hallway, his hand gripping Chloe's arm with bruising force. He was a beaten animal, desperate to crawl back into the dark, desperate to escape the blinding light of his own ruin. But I was not quite finished pulling away the foundation of his fabricated life. We are not done yet, I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the thick, tense air of the monarch room with absolute, uncompromising authority. It was the tone of a judge delivering a final sentence. Marcus froze. He did not want to turn around. His entire body was rigid with the primal urge to flee, but the commanding weight of my words anchored his polished shoes to the expensive carpet. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned his head, his face a ghastly shade of gray. Chloe whimpered, pressing a trembling hand against her tear-streaked face. Brad and Tasha, who had been hovering near the exit, froze like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. I reached down to this briefcase resting beside my chair and pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder. The camera of my mind pushes in close, framing my hand as I lift the dense stack of documents high above the table. With a sharp, deliberate downward thrust, I slammed the folder onto the solid mahogany surface. The sharp, echoing crack of the heavy paper hitting the wood sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. It was the sound of absolute finality. I rested my hand flat on top of the manila cover, my eyes locking onto the terrified faces of my former family members. The perspective slowly shifts, acting as a continuous, sweeping, circular dolly shot. The invisible camera glides smoothly around the perimeter of the grand dining table, bathing the scene in a cinematic golden glow from the crystal chandeliers above. As the camera moves, it creates a breathtaking visual contrast. On one side of the frame, it captures my absolute, unshakable serenity. I sit with perfect posture, my breathing even, my hands relaxed, entirely in control of the universe I had built. As the camera continues its slow orbit, it sweeps across the table to capture the chaotic, suffocating panic radiating from the doorway. As I mentioned earlier, Vanguard Group is a multifaceted private equity firm. I began, my tone smooth and strictly professional, letting the words drift across the space between us. While we do dabble in high-end hospitality, our primary, most lucrative division is commercial real estate acquisition. We buy distressed, mismanaged, or undervalued commercial properties, clean up the books, and optimize the tenant portfolios. I watched Brad's eyes dart toward the folder. The sickening realization of what a commercial real estate buyout meant was slowly beginning to penetrate his thick, arrogant skull. The camera glides behind my shoulder, framing Brad's pale, sweating face in the distance. Exactly 3 weeks ago, I continued tracing the edge of the folder with my index finger. Vanguard finalized the purchase of a very specific, highly sought-after commercial block in the downtown financial district. The absolute crown jewel of that acquisition was Commercial Building 42. The blood completely drained from Chloe's face. She let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. Brad stumbled backward, his shoulders slamming hard against the oak doorframe. His mouth fell open, but his vocal cords were utterly paralyzed. Commercial Building 42 was not just any piece of real estate. It was the physical manifestation of their entirely fake luxury lifestyle. It was the prestigious address they slapped on glossy business cards and bragged about at country club mixers to validate their fraudulent existence. "You know the building very well, Chloe," I said, my gaze drilling into her panicked, widening eyes as the circular dolly continues its relentless, smooth orbit, emphasizing her trembling frame. "It houses your exclusive high-end vanity project on the ground floor." The luxury beauty studio with the imported Italian marble floors, the custom crystal chandeliers, and the complimentary champagne bar for your elite clientele. And Brad It houses your premier real estate brokerage firm on the third floor. The coveted corner suite with the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I flipped the heavy folder open. Inside were stacks of heavily highlighted financial audits, lease agreements, and bank statements. The rustle of the paper was the only sound competing with their frantic, shallow breathing. When my asset management team took over the property, their first protocol was to run a comprehensive forensic audit on the existing tenant ledgers. I explained, flipping to a specific page filled with stark red ink. And what they found was truly fascinating. It appears that the tenants occupying the ground floor beauty studio and the third floor brokerage firm are suffering from severe terminal financial insolvency. I looked up, letting the silence stretch out until the tension in the room was physically unbearable. "You are 4 months delinquent on your commercial leases," I stated clearly, the words hanging heavily in the air. "Both of you." Chloe began to shake her head frantically from side to side, her expensive diamond earrings catching the chandelier light as she instinctively backed away from the truth. "It is a temporary cash flow issue," Brad blurted out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that entirely shattered his macho facade. "The market is slow right now. We had agreements with the previous landlord. We had verbal extensions. We were going to pay it back." "You do not have verbal extensions with Vanguard Group," I replied, my voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising chill. "And it is not a market issue, Brad. It is a theft issue. You did not pay your overhead because you were too busy funneling the operating capital into maintaining a fraudulent lifestyle." I turned my attention entirely to Chloe, who was now hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stared at the folder in absolute terror. "You took the money Marcus stole from Jamal's college fund," I said, my words striking her like physical blows. "You took $250,000 in stolen funds, routed it through Brad's fraudulent loan applications, and instead of paying your rent, you bought limited edition designer handbags. You bought imported shoes. You leased luxury vehicles to impress people who do not even care about you. You chose vanity over basic financial obligation. You bought a lie, and now the bill is due." I reached into the folder and pulled out 2 crisp, legally stamped documents. I slid them aggressively across the long mahogany table. They glided over the polished wood, stopping mere inches from where Marcus and Brad were standing. The slow, circular camera movement pauses, locking onto the stark white papers resting on the dark wood. "Those are formal, legally executed notices of immediate eviction," I announced. "Due to the sheer volume of the rental arrears combined with the fact that you submitted fabricated corporate financial reports to secure the initial lease agreements, the standard 30-day grace period is entirely voided. You are in material breach of contract compounded by active federal fraud." Brad stared down at the eviction notice bearing his name. The bold black letters stamped across the top of the page seemed to burn directly into his retinas. His entire firm, his livelihood, the very office where he conducted his shady backroom deals was gone. "You have exactly 24 hours to clear your personal belongings out of my property," I stated, my tone offering absolutely zero room for negotiation or mercy. "By this time tomorrow, the locks on both the beauty studio and the brokerage firm will be changed. Anything left inside will be seized, liquidated, and applied toward your massive outstanding debt to my company." The reality of total, unmitigated ruin finally shattered Brad's mind completely. The cowardly broker snapped. He spun around, his large hands desperately grabbing Marcus by the lapels of his rumpled, sweat-stained suit. "Do something!" Brad shrieked, his voice echoing hysterically in the elegant dining room, his face mere inches from Marcus's. "You said you had this under control. You told me the bridge loan covered the rent. You told me the shell companies were untraceable. Fix this. Marcus, transfer the funds. Call your investors and get the money to cover my lease right now." Brad was shaking his brother-in-law violently, spit flying from his lips as he begged, his eyes wide and crazed. "My entire firm is in that suite. My client files my private servers, my operating license. If I get locked out tomorrow, I am bankrupt. Tasha and I will lose the house. Fix it. You promised me we were safe. Do something. Marcus did not respond. He could not respond. The narcissistic collapse was absolute, physical, and total. He stood there while Brad shook him, his arms hanging limply at his sides, his jaw slack, his eyes wide and completely vacant. He looked like a machine that had simply been unplugged from the wall. There was no arrogant smirk. There was no booming baritone voice commanding the room. There was no clever lie, no gaslighting manipulation, no aggressive posturing. The grand illusion of Marcus Harrison was dead, replaced by a hollow, broken man who was finally being forced to look at the devastating, inescapable reality of his own actions. He could not save Brad. He could not save Chloe. He could not even save himself. He was going to federal prison, and he was going to go there as a penniless, exposed fraud who had just been utterly dismantled by the woman he had deemed worthless. Jamal, who had been sitting quietly beside me the entire time, let out a soft, amused scoff. He looked at the chaotic, pathetic display unfolding at the end of the table, his face a portrait of mature, calm vindication. "You cannot write a check with a frozen bank account, Uncle Brad," Jamal said smoothly, his deep voice slicing effortlessly through Brad's hysterical screaming. "And you cannot borrow money when the FBI is currently reviewing your forged loan applications. My father is not going to save you. He is broke, he is caught, and he is going to jail. I highly recommend you stop shaking him and spend your next 24 hours packing your boxes instead of begging a criminal for a miracle." I gave a final decisive nod to Henri, the general manager, who immediately stepped forward, signaling the two large, imposing security guards waiting in the corridor. "It is time for you to leave," I said, picking up my glass of Bordeaux and taking a slow, victorious sip. "Have a wonderful evening." Just as Marcus took his first shuffling step toward the service corridor, the heavy oak doors at the opposite end of the hallway swung violently open. The camera pulls back into a dramatic, sweeping wide shot from the doorway of the VIP room, capturing the entirety of the opulent space and the sudden chaotic intrusion. Two federal agents, their windbreakers clearly emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the FBI, stepped into the light. They were flanked by three uniformed local police officers. Together they formed an impenetrable wall of authority, completely sealing off the only remaining exit. The lead agent, a tall woman with a steely, uncompromising gaze, stepped forward. Her voice cut effortlessly through the soft ambient jazz music drifting from the main dining room. "Marcus Harrison and Bradley Jenkins," she announced, her tone devoid of any emotion. "We hold emergency federal arrest warrants for both of you." Marcus froze, his chest heaving as his oxygen evaporated. Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, scrambling backward until her spine hit the mahogany wall paneling, her manicured hands clutching her throat. The officers moved with practiced, terrifying efficiency. Before Marcus could process the words, a police officer spun him around, forcing his wrists roughly behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the quiet room. It was a sound so final and absolute that it seemed to make the expensive crystal on the table vibrate. Marcus went completely limp. His legs gave out, and two officers had to physically hold him upright. He stared blankly at the floor, his entire identity collapsing under the weight of federal restraints. Brad did not freeze. The sound of the handcuffs snapping shut on Marcus triggered a spectacular, cowardly explosion of pure self-preservation. As an officer grabbed his arms, Brad thrashed wildly, his face turning an apoplectic shade of crimson. "Get your hands off me!" Brad screamed, his voice pitching into a frantic frenzy. He twisted his neck, glaring at Marcus with pure, unfiltered venom. "It was him! It was all him! You set me up, you arrogant bastard!" Brad's survival instincts completely overrode any lingering familial loyalty. He lunged against the officer's grip, spitting his accusations directly at Marcus's slumped figure. "You lied to me. You told me those assets were clean. You tricked me into signing those dummy reports to push the loan through. I have the emails, Marcus. I kept every single email you ever sent me. I will give the feds everything. I will testify to every shell company, every fake appraisal, every stolen dollar to get my sentence reduced. You are taking the fall for this alone." Marcus did not lift his head to acknowledge the betrayal. He stood there in his wrinkled suit, completely dead to the world, as the officers began marching them toward the exit. Watching her husband being hauled away, Tasha completely unraveled. The illusion of her flawless, wealthy existence shattered. She spun around, her high heels slipping on the marble floor, and lunged back toward the dining table. She threw herself across the mahogany surface, her hands desperately grabbing onto my forearm. Her grip was painfully tight. "Nia, please," Tasha wailed, her face contorted in panic, dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. "You cannot let them do this. We are family. We are blood." Brad was just following Marcus's orders. "Please, you have to talk to them. You have all the evidence. Just tell the agents it was a misunderstanding. Tell them Brad was a victim. Naya, sister to sister, please put in a good word for him." The wide shot holds steady, capturing the pathetic tableau of Tasha weeping over the table. I looked down at Tasha's trembling hands. I did not raise my voice or show an ounce of anger. Slowly, with surgical precision, I reached over and peeled her fingers off my arm one by one. I placed her hand back onto the cold wood and looked into her terrified eyes. "Family." I repeated the word, tasting like ash. "You did not want to be family when I was at the bottom, Tasha. Do not try to claim blood now that I am at the top. Your husband's fate is out of my hands. Now get out of my restaurant." Tasha recoiled as if burned, stumbling backward into the hallway where a local police officer immediately took her by the arm to escort her away. With Brad sobbing and Tasha out of the picture, only Marcus and Chloe remained in the iron grip of the federal agents. The sheer gravity of the moment finally crushed whatever remaining defiance Marcus held. His knees buckled entirely. The officers caught him under the arms, but he sagged toward the floor, a pathetic, crumpled mess of a man whose empire of lies had just evaporated. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for a lifeline that did not exist. He looked at me, finding only a blank, unyielding stare. He looked at the general manager, who stood like a marble statue in the corner. Then his bloodshot eyes locked onto the tall, broad-shouldered young man sitting calmly to my right. "Jamal." Marcus strained against the federal agents, holding him upright, his face twisting into a mask of desperate manufactured anguish. Stripped of his money, his power, and his leverage, he played his final, most pathetic card. "Jamal," Marcus cried out, his voice cracking with a forced, breathless panic. "Son, look at me. You cannot let them do this. You cannot let your own father go to federal prison. Tell her to stop this. We are blood, Jamal. Family has to protect each other." The room fell dead silent, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the cornered fraud. Jamal did not flinch. He did not look away, nor did he show a single ounce of the emotional turmoil Marcus was desperately trying to provoke. Slowly, with the deliberate grace of a man who owned the room, Jamal stood up from his leather dining chair. He reached down and casually buttoned the center button of his tailored Tom Ford vest. The pristine fabric smoothed perfectly over his chest, highlighting a quiet, terrifying sovereignty that completely mirrored my own. He looked down at the man who had spent years trying to break us. "You sold my future, Marcus," Jamal said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried no anger, only absolute finality. "You stole the money meant for my education to feed the bottomless greed of a woman who spent the last 5 years calling my mother a broke waitress. You chose an illusion over your own son. You threw us away because we did not fit into the fake plastic life you were trying to build." Jamal took a single step forward, towering over the defeated man. "Family protects each other," Jamal agreed softly. "That is exactly why I am sitting next to my mother today. But you stopped being family a long time ago. The law makes no exceptions for being a scumbag, Mr. Harrison. Have a safe trip downtown." Marcus let out a guttural, wounded noise, his head dropping to his chest as the last string tying him to a decent life was permanently severed. The lead FBI agent gave a sharp nod. "Get them out of here," she ordered. The officers yanked Marcus upward, dragging him roughly toward the hallway. But the true spectacle was Chloe. As the reality of the cold steel handcuffs biting into her wrists fully registered, her fragile materialistic mind completely snapped. "No!" Chloe shrieked, a high, piercing wail that shattered the quiet elegance of the restaurant. "You cannot do this. Do you know who I am? My bag is Chanel. My shoes are imported. Get your hands off my silk jacket. The officers ignored her flailing, marching her out of the VIP wing and directly toward the front exit. Because the federal vehicles were parked at the main entrance, Chloe and Marcus were paraded directly through the main dining room. The restaurant was operating at peak capacity, packed with the exact high society elite Chloe had spent her entire life trying to impress. As she was dragged through the crowded, glowing lobby, every single fork stopped moving. Every conversation ceased. Hundreds of wealthy patrons turned to watch the hysterical, sobbing woman being hauled out by federal agents. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark rivers, ruining her expensive makeup, while her frantic screams echoed off the crystal chandeliers, cementing her absolute public destruction.